and welcome to another poetry prompt process video. It's quite hard to say that quickly. It's like a tongue twister. Poetry prompt process, and this month it is for the prompt of the word extra. So I said, I think I mentioned on the post for this prompt and also in the podcast, which was also about this word, that I just wanted to start focusing on one word prompts, because it's one of those things, I suppose, the fewer words you give yourself, actually the more directions you can often go in. So for this month, dropped my pen there. For this month I decided to go with extra. You'll have to excuse my voice if it sounds a little bit gravelly, because I've had a bit of a cold. So yes, it might be a bit scratchy and a little bit quiet, but so when I started to think about the word extra, I just wanted to write down as many different thoughts, I suppose, as I could for the word. So when we think of extra, in terms of how people use it to describe someone, oh, she's very extra, it usually means too much, too loud, taking up too much space, sort of an excess, a sort of surplus to requirements sort of thing. And I'll kind of elaborate on this later when we get to it, when I'm writing it, but for me, I've grown to realise that surplus to requirements doesn't mean that we brought too much of ourselves. It just means that actually they couldn't manage what we brought. So, and then the other side of extra that I'm writing here is the fact that too much, is it too much? Or, like I say, is it more than you know how to handle? So more than abundance. If someone says, I'm going to give you an extra 20% off, or I'm going to give you an extra £10 that you can spend today, that's abundance, that's expansion, it's a very good thing. So I've labelled them as bad and good, which I don't like using generally because there's so much more nuance in life than just bad or good, but it was more to help me in the direction that I wanted to go in, because I knew that I wanted to start with what's labelled as bad and then end with what's labelled as good, to sort of switch the meaning around. And another thing that I thought about when I was thinking about the word extra, and this actually came from me visiting my son's classroom. They were doing a sort of open morning, a maths open morning, and you could go in and you could watch how they taught maths, which I'm very familiar with because I am also a teacher. But they were doing division, they were doing remainders particularly, and the first ones they started with to introduce the concept in quite a manageable way for them was to introduce the concept of remainders as odd numbers always have one left over. They can't be divided by two. They can't be split off equally and neatly into pairs, I suppose. So I then decided I would take this idea of odd numbers, because often when people say, oh, you're so extra, actually what they mean is kind of odd, like you're standing out, you're like that one left over, that odd one that doesn't blend in like everyone else does. So I had these few different variations of what I thought extra meant, and then I decided I would start writing it up, really. So I went with the idea of excess and surplus, and this idea that if you fill a glass of water with too much, with excess, it will spill over the top. And I think that's what people mean when they say extra. They say it like you're too much for the glass, you're too much water, you're spilling over the top, and you need to rein it in a bit and clean yourself up, sort of thing. So I started with that, and then went with you're taking up too much space, you're too loud, like I say, sort of too much for what this room can handle, because often that's what it means. When we are extra, and I say that in sort of inverted commas, but when we are extra, essentially what that means is we are just being ourselves in a space that doesn't know how to make room for that, I think is it. So I initially wrote extra like a spill you should clean up, like you something, what did I write? Like you take up too much space in the world. You took up too much space and took up more space than the room knew how to hold. And actually, I changed it around to say it isn't necessarily about taking up space in that sense. It's like as if we brought more of ourselves than the room knew how to hold. And then to just sort of underline it, really cement it. Extra words, extra feelings, too loud, too bright. And then I had this suddenly thought that I'm just scribbling down here, is this too much like breathe, too loud, too quiet, too fierce or too weak. So in the end I actually removed that part of the poem because I did just think perhaps it's a little bit too similar. Although that hasn't really stopped me before. I write similar things over and over again, so I don't know why I chose it for this point, but and then I started to write about odd numbers, but I thought I need something that links what I've just said to the idea of odd numbers, because I really wanted that idea of people label others as extra, and what they mean is odd. So I didn't want to just jump straight from extra to odd, and then this kind of got into that whole they call you odd, they call you extra. And then just to sort of try and explain what I mean by the whole odd thing, because odd numbers refuse to fit into pairs. They refuse to, I suppose, shrink and disappear into each other. So I was thinking about when I sat in my son's maths lesson again, and it would be like 25 divided by 2, and then they were finding remainders. They were finding the remainder. The other 24 numbers were just swallowed into something else. It was that one that stood out, and so I wanted to focus on that, this idea that being odd means that you're refusing to shrink and disappear into what everyone else is doing, really. You're refusing to blend in, is essentially the point. And I wrote a quote ages ago, actually, on Instagram, I think, and it said, "You can't be extraordinary without being a little extra." And that thought kind of came to me here. And it made me realise that actually extraordinary, if we break it down, is the word extraordinary, and it just means going beyond what you thought were the limits. You're just pushing the bar, pushing the boundaries a little bit. So that bit came to me, and in the end, you can't be extraordinary without being a little extra. That becomes the final line of the poem, because that's sort of what I'm leading up to. So here I just wanted to then expand on the odd number idea. Before this, you saw me scribbling some things next to the word overflowing. So when I started to think about excess and too much, surplus to requirements, I thought about, like I say, about a glass of water spilling over the edge. And then I wanted to write overflowing, and you'll have seen I wrote it right in the middle of the bad and the good side, because overflowing can kind of be both. We can be overflowing with love or overflowing with hate, and one of those is often more productive than the other, depending on how we use them, of course. That's a whole other topic for discussion. But I wrote overflowing, and then I realised that could be my bridge, just the way it had been when I wrote it out. That could be my bridge between the two ends of the poem, really, the sandwich part in the middle. And you'll see that I wrote like contrasting waves and droplets. So you've got like the waves of the ocean, then you've just got like little droplets. The idea that the waves are the extra, but the waves are what keep us afloat, kind of thing. The waves are what have the capacity actually to drown you if they so feel. The waves are powerful compared, particularly, I suppose, to the little droplets of water. So anyway, that's on the other side. I parked that. I went a little bit more with the odd thing, and then I started to talk about that idea of being brave enough to not just blend in, being brave enough to not disappear, and then on the flip side of that, being brave enough to kind of stand up, stand out, and that made me think of stand up and be counted. you can see my whole thought process. It's just like runs away with itself sometimes. So I ended up, and as always, what I'm writing here isn't the way that the poem ended up in the end, but it's roughly there. When I type it up, there's always a bit of editing done, and when this poem goes into a book, there will also be editing done there as well, so it won't remain exactly like this. But I wanted to focus on that idea of being the one left standing when the counting's done, when the counting's finished, that one that's left standing out, that remainder, even though you're not a remainder, you're not forgotten, you're not left behind, but this idea that you are the one left when the counting is finished, sort of thing. And then, in order to move me from this idea of being odd, being too much, being surplus to requirements, I wanted to move and explain, like, actually, extra is just what happens when we go beyond what people thought we could be, or what people expect us to be. There's something very powerful in that, so going beyond those imposed limits. And at first I was thinking, like, it's about refusing to go beyond the limits, or even just like not listening, ignoring them. But actually, it's listening but choosing to keep going anyway. And that, I think, is a more powerful message than I'm just ignoring you and doing my own thing, which is essentially what you're doing. But it's almost saying, like, I hear you, I get what you're saying, but actually I don't feel like I have to do that. And so in the end, the line became, extra is what happens when ordinary reaches its limit and keeps going anyway. I think the line actually became something slightly different from that. There might have been even a little bit more in it, but essentially that's it. So here I'm just writing that very final line that I mentioned earlier onto the top of this paper, squeezing it in wherever I can, just to, I suppose, cement it. That's what I'm heading towards. That, the whole message of the poem is that extra isn't a bad thing. The beginning of the poem makes it seem like it is, but it's not. And you can't be extraordinary without being a little extra. I'm just moving things out of the way because I've realised I need extra paper here. And I've found some that actually has something else on the other side, but I'm just going to use this to scribble on. So I'm doing that thing where I refer back to what I've already made notes on and just crossing out anything I've covered. So here I've recognised that I want these ideas to be the ending and this idea about the water, the droplets, to be the bridge. I'm still not 100% sure how at this point. I've realised I want to, I suppose, make it a little bit more poetic in the middle. So I've got waves and droplets, and then I've written buckets and teaspoons. So it's still water. I don't know why I went with water. Oh, because of the overflowing thing. That's why I went with water. So extra is what happens when ordinary reaches its limit and keeps going anyway. It just felt like it wasn't big enough to be the bridge. It wasn't, it just wasn't enough to switch from this is what you think extra is, but actually it's a really good thing. So I wanted to add this other bit. So let them measure in teaspoons whilst you arrive in bucketfuls. I actually change this in a minute to whilst you arrive in waves. But I decided I wanted to add even more ideas to this, like contrasting ideas. So we've got obviously a lot of water, a little bit of water. And then I thought of the whole odd number. So we've got even steps, and then the idea of this just kind of like skipping down the street. And then sort of like colour and like colouring inside the lines and outside of the lines. I think those people that are extra or deemed as extra, they're the ones that aren't afraid to step outside of the lines that people have drawn for them. And so colouring inside the lines and outside of the lines seemed to sort of be a metaphor for that for me. So that's why I went with those. So let them measure in teaspoons whilst you arrive with bucketfuls, which then changes to waves in a minute. Let them colour inside the lines and count in even steps whilst you, I think it says, whilst you skip and jump your way through a brand new picture. Yeah, as if like you don't even need the lines because you're going to draw your own lines here. So yeah, and then to sort of wind it up, going back to what I'd written as those ending words right at the beginning, your extra is not art, it is abundance, it's expansion, it is the courage to take up space. Obviously, I'm thinking here because not everything immediately comes to me. Obviously, I know the poem now, and I know sort of the whole process it took me to get there, but in the moment, I tend to pause and think, or just write anything and everything that comes to mind, and then make it fit afterwards. So yeah, like I say, we're moving now beyond the bridge towards the very end. Then I suddenly had this random idea about diamonds and how actually they're kind of jagged, and whilst if we're being very, very specific about it, when they're cut, they are cut in a very even, patterned way. I'm going to just use poetic license and pretend that they're not. But the idea is really they're not smooth, they're not soft, that they're spiky, that they stand out. You know, they're not afraid to stand out. The whole reason that they're cut outside of those smooth, soft lines is because they're cut to shine, not to disappear, not to blend in. And I thought actually that fits very nicely with what I want to say. So yeah, so then I'm just kind of finishing up really, adding the little bit about the diamonds in, because then after this sort of little paragraph, it will be that ending quote that I'd put before. So remember, you can't be extraordinary without being a little extra, my love. I have kind of not specific, well, it's all very much in you, but when I came to type it up, I switched a bit of that and it became more about extra rather than you. So in the middle, instead of saying like you're not afraid to stand up or stand out or stand your ground or anything like that, it becomes about extra as a thing, as a concept. It becomes about odd numbers as a thing, as a concept, rather than constantly being related to you as such. So yeah, I just kind of tweaked that a little bit. I think sometimes it's one of those things that I always play with anyway in poetry when I'm writing, is those kind of opposites, and one of those opposites can be proximity and distance. So it starts being very personal, you know, they call you extra, like you're a spill they should clean up, and then right at the end you can't be extraordinary without being a little extra. But in the middle, it almost removes you, in inverted commas, it almost removes you, the reader, from it, to say, look, if you take out yourself from this word, look at all the things it means. You know, almost a kind of like, don't take it personally. But then at the end of the poem, don't take it personally, but you know what, if you do, it's a really good thing, sort of thing. So that's how I work. And then I just ended up sort of numbering and ordering the poem. Oh yes, I added this little bit in here because, again, it's gone from you, and then it went to like it, extra as a thing, as a concept, and then it went to them, so it's putting the onus back onto someone else not being able to hold you. Let them measure in teaspoons whilst you arrive in waves, let them colour inside the lines whilst you know, paint a brand new picture. And then I just wanted this little sentence that leads us back to you, because you are the one that, and then I just pulled words from what I'd already written. So I'd written skips and jumps down the road toward, you are the one that skips the pattern. The water, thinking about the teaspoon and the waves, you are the water that tips the balance. you are the colour that, and I don't know what to write here, so I end up just writing something that ends up changing in a bit, but the colour that doesn't fit inside the lines, essentially. And yeah, like I say, I change it a little bit, but otherwise not so much. And then here, I am just ordering, just writing, sort of popping it into paragraphs really to make it easier, in terms of not just typing it up in order, but formatting as well. Recognising I need to start a new paragraph here, or a new line could go here, or, you know, etc. So there it is, the whole poem, all about the word extra and all of the different things it can mean, but mostly that it's a good thing if you're extra. I'll see you next time.